Thank you, Adnan. No trouble at all. Got here safely, early in the morning, but that's fine. So let me start by saying that on 27th April 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected president in South Africa's first democratic elections, ending the country's era of apartheid. In Rwanda, earlier that same month, Hutu power began its mass genocide of between 500,000 and 1 million Tutsis, as well as tens of thousands of Hutu moderates. As Professor Mahmoud Mamdani stated, if some seer had told us in the late 1980s that there would be a genocide in one of these two countries, I wonder how many amongst us would have managed to identify correctly its location. This statement prompts the question of what led to South Africa's relatively smooth transition from apartheid to a democratic state, while 1,500 miles north, the Arusha Peace Accord ended in an ethnic bloodbath. A divided society is compromised or composed of groups formed along ethnic, racial, religious, regional, and class lines. The post-Second World War solution to conflict generally fell in two camps. Number one was the Nuremberg solution, and number two was the ICC solution, the International Criminal Court. Nuremberg has been turned into a template for how to deal with mass violence. But Nuremberg took place at the end of a war between states. It was the product of victory on one side and defeat on the other. The essence of South Africa's situation was that it was a stalemate. Both sides acknowledged that. At Nuremberg, the logic of the victorious powers was that victims and perpetrators must not share a common future. The endpoint of such thinking after Nuremberg was, of course, the state of Israel. The victims must have their own state. For any settlement on the African continent, this logic cannot work. Whites and blacks had to live in the same country in South Africa. Hutu and Tutsi have to live in the same country in Rwanda. Of course, there are exceptions. Ethiopia and Eritrea, South Sudan and Sudan. But these are exceptions. We are looking for a process that will help to construct inclusive communities rather than separation. Wherever we have tried the judicial model on this continent, which is Africa, a solution has evaded us. Wherever we have tried or had a modicum of a solution in Africa, the heart of it was a political and not a judicial process. And some examples are, look at Mozambique. Renamo, which was the opposition, and a violent political opposition, now sits in government. Compare this to Uganda, where the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, is still viewed as having committed acts of terror, and so on. The Ugandan parliament passed an amnesty bill for the LRA, but the presidency, in cahoots with the ICC, ignored this And now the LRA leadership is on the ICC wanted list. What is it that we cannot have is that a winner-takes-all process in a divided society. In South Africa, we had the Convention for Democratic South Africa, which led to various concessions, allowed for local democratic government and redistribution without the consent of the minority. The problem is that for a durable and inclusive solution, you are going to have to bridge and mediate some very sensitive and sensibilities. And this led to another problem that we had to deal with. And that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I'm sure many of you have heard of that. But the problem with the TRC was that it defined victims as though no apartheid had ever existed, simply as individuals whose bodily integrity had been violated. That is to put apartheid on the same plane as any dictatorship anywhere in the world. And I'm reminded of the occasion when, at the end of the exhaustive TRC process, Archbishop Tutu had to hand the report to government. And I was working in government at that time as what our colleague called a spin doctor. And 2 hours before the report was going to be released to the world media, the ANC objected to the release of the document simply because the contents and the issue in the reports had equated the ANC in exile and the crimes that were committed against the ANC and some that the ANC had committed on the same plane and same level as the crimes committed by the apartheid government. So the victor and the victim were identified on the same plane. And it created a huge problem. But apartheid affected the entire society, not just isolated individuals. Its cutting edge was legislation that defined the whole population into groups it called races. Then it passed laws that enabled a minority and disabled a majority. What is common to the TRC and the ICC process is that both ignore the issue that led to the violence. But there is no real way forward unless we take on the issues. And this is the issue of not tolerance, but acknowledgement. You see, the TRC exchanged truth for justice. What people wanted was acknowledgement of the torture and the crime that was committed. Because if you don't acknowledge the crime, there can be no social reconstruction and reconciliation. There is a difference between political violence and criminal violence. Political violence has a constituency. It's not just about individual perpetrators. And that was the problem with the TRC. It went after individual perpetrators at the expense of those who were in command. So at the end of the day, people were asked, so who gave you the command and how many did you kill? at the expense of the 20,000 to 30,000 victims. So if you want to make, or if we wanted to make the TRC more relevant for the future, the TRC could have educated the white population that although most of them were not perpetrators, they were beneficiaries. But then it would have had to take the limelight away from torture, and so we had to refocus on who had benefited. Just my last 2 points. In order to get to the point where you involve in nation building and social reconciliation, you are faced with 3 major tasks and challenges. Number 1 is national identity and national reconciliation. Number 2, state formation and institution building. And the last one is socio-economic transformation and sustainable development. Let me end with this as a challenge to the youth living in Europe and other parts of the world. I'm going to call it a challenge to Muslim sensitivities and sensibilities. We experienced this pre-apartheid and post-apartheid. Number 1, when Salman Rushdie wrote his book, Satanic Verses, Muslims were called on to come out and object. In an apartheid society, we were faced with many tribulations. The government was prepared to ban the book. Muslims, if they sided with government, were caught in a quandary. What position did we have to take? And what position did we take? Number 2, post-apartheid, a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. Muslims in a secular society, what position do we take? That's the challenge for the youth living in secular democracies. Let's see how they relate to that. Thank you.